So with this, Nigel, I would ask you to open the next slide, which says what we are talking about today. It's an honor to be invited, I must say so, by Catherine and the good offices of Gordon Brady to do this, because I told Gordon Brady about a book, and he said, wonderful, this is a topic which is timely: public goods, sustainable development, and the contribution of business. There is no subtitle, as you can see, because this is the right, on the left-hand side, you see the book in its splendor. But what it is about is linking corporate responsibility and sustainable development. This is the contribution of business. And we are 4 presenters. I did my own presentation right now. And perhaps Arthur, you may speak out. We will see a picture of 4 of us. If you go on, Nigel, with the next slide, please, you can see all of us. Arthur, why don't you speak out a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I'd be more than happy to. My name is Arthur Rubens. Retired as a professor of management in 2017, and I was awarded Professor Emeritus at Florida Gulf Coast University. I probably have about 30 years experience in academia and working as a consultant and having a small business. And currently I'm a visiting professor at Audencia Business School, which is in Nantes, France. However, I will make note that it's been over a year since I've been in France with COVID. So our classes have been online as this conference is online. But I, like Rowan, am very, very happy to be here and to speak about our book and a topic that we find very, very important indeed.
Thank you, Arthur. And by order of the alphabet, Raymond would be next, but he's not here yet. So Licia, can you speak out about yourself, please? Unmute yourself. Licia? It looks like she doesn't listen. So when she comes in to present, we will ask her again. We go on and show the agenda. Nigel, please.
Not the majority of population, older people, but what is prediction?
2050.
Is how much?
Aha, this is the voice of Raymond. Raymond, will you unmute yourself?
You have to key, I don't remember.
We hear too much.
But it will be 1 out of 7.
Okay. Licia, will you unmute yourself, please?
She's unmuted.
No, she's not.
Oh, she shows up as unmuted on my screen.
Okay. Anyhow, I will speak loud. What we say and what everyone is adopting is that the public good theme and sustainable development are closely interlinked. And this is the same linkage between corporate responsibility and sustainable development. So if all act according to what this link is about, we can improve the current and future welfare of communities. At home, meaning, and in the third world. Interestingly enough, in Germany, sustainable development in the federal government is attached to the Ministry of Economic Cooperation. And interestingly also, the topic of human rights and business, which is somehow related, is attached to the Foreign Secretary, because the Ministry of Economics and Business and the Ministry of Social Affairs didn't really agree on who does what. So that is why we say at home and abroad. And I had said there that everyone will agree, but it's, if you read a book about sustainable development, and there are hundreds and thousands of articles, it's not that this link is coming out clearly. So when we say sustainable development is equal to preserving and maintaining public goods, then there comes a liability, a responsibility, and there has to be actions to deliver. And what we often do not find, and all my publications, as I said, I was in business until about 1999, and then I started teaching. So all my writings And this book also tries to connect the economists or the macrosphere and the business world, the microsphere, because very often managers do not read books which are written in a tone that is not their daily wording. So that's why we say there must be a closure of the gap between not just the public and the private sectors, but also the understanding on those various levels. Next, please. We were happy to get a very nice endorsements. They are listed to the left, and the one I was really happy about is Edward Freeman it is, sorry. He says, at last, a book that makes business a critical element of the conversation about sustainable development in a multi-institutional environment. Main point here is that very often you think, and young people also think, it's about the government who will do it all. And this is, at last, we talk about this link and also the link between the public goods theme and sustainable development, because we think it's all in one. Sorry, may I have the next slide, please? And this would be the 4 parts where we also structure our presentation. And this is what is the parts of the book. There is to be a presentation about what is public goods and from where can you access this. You can access this, and that's what we call the 3 basic approaches, from the sociological side, from the financial side, and you can have it from the ethical side. So there are 3 basic approaches, and each approach has a policy consequence, and it's very important. An operational definition, in my opinion, is where you can say X is like Z, and therefore we can do Z in the following way. And then we have a lot of argumentations about who should and who should not deliver public goods. So that would be the phenomenon. Then we have part 2. Where do we find this in the official statistics and in the private reporting of companies? And then we have why we say the contribution of business. What do businesses in this context? And then how can you improve that linkage, both on the theoretical part, also on the practical part, that businesses and governments and CSOs and young people and old people are in the boat all together. Thank you. Next one, please. And other Rubens will take over.
Okay, thank you very much, Rowan. I'm going to just very briefly talk about public goods, what are public goods, and talk about business and the changing role of business. But before I address public good, and as Rowan talked about, why is the public goods theme so important right now? And and historically, when we think of public goods, we think of it maybe from a local perspective, maybe something that's good for a community, something that's good for a country. But what I would put forward, and what we are putting forward, the world we live in is very, very different today. It is a globalized, interconnected, interdependent world. And the problems that we are having currently, and the problems that we will have in the future will be global problems. They'll be very vast indeed. And these type of problems will require a global solution. When we think of public goods, the deliverer of public goods, we historically think of the state, as Rowan talked about earlier, giving them. But there's a much larger group that has to give them. And just very briefly, in regard to the concept of the global problems that the world will be confronted with, because of the interconnected nature and globalized nature of the world, when you have an event like climate, well, it affects all countries, not just a singular countries or trade, or if you impose certain trade embargoes or so forth. Well, with our open sourcing, with production methods, then you're affecting countries all over the world. So what we speak about, and and what is spoken about, is that a country needs to be open, and a country needs to be integrated with a much more larger coalition, because it will take a global solution to respond to the world. And I think more than anything else, with us talking online, not meeting in person due to COVID, that this has highlighted the aspects of that. Now, next slide, please. And this idea of looking at things globally as far as the problems of the world isn't anything new. The Millennium Project was done accordingly in the early 2000s, and they in that identified 15 different areas of goals or concerns that needed to be addressed. Climate, water, resources, population, growth of population, democratization, technology, the gap between the rich and the poor, health issues, education, peace and conflict, so forth. And they, of course, are not the only body, but they were, one of the early bodies that said we need to identify these problems that exist in the world, and we as a world need to come together to address them. And when we address them, we need to include all participants involved with it. But before I talk about business and the role of business, let me just briefly back up for a second and just talk about the definitions of public goods. Next slide, please. When we talk about public goods, the definitions or the general way of interpreting them are they are goods that largely benefit society, that serve a collective public purpose. These goods, these public goods, are generally thought to be and looked at as being non-rivalrous in nature, that the consumption of this good does not affect another's opportunity to consume the good. And also non-excludable. They don't exclude people. Nobody is denied the good. Everybody has the opportunity to consume the good. Examples, when we think about, and I put several examples here, national defense. National defense, you pay taxes within a particular country or a larger coalition, and they are there to defend the greater populace. Police, same thing, or at least it's thought and believed to be the same things. Parks, beaches, public broadcasts. These are all regarded as public goods to some degree or the other. We'll talk about the little nuance of it. More specific and more currently, vaccination with COVID. We in the US have had a very, we'll say, robust vaccination program. And of course, in our system, one of the first questions that's often asked is, what is the cost of vaccination? Well, there is no cost, because it is for the public good that all people become vaccinated, which that is an effort in itself. Next slide, please. Contrast that with private goods. Private goods, and we're all familiar with private goods, are goods that are both, again, according to the definition, rivalrous and excludable. So one has to pay for them, and they exclude people unless, maybe there's not a payment for it. So when we look at schools, for example, schools, primary and secondary education is generally regarded as a public good, and it's available, where there can be, both in primary and secondary education, schools that are not open for all people, that there is a cost for them, and they do exclude people. In the US in particular, university education is quite costly. So there is a cost associated with it. If you want to fly somewhere from one country to the other, there's a cost. Example of a private good, we give milk, well, here you consume the milk, you have a glass of milk, you're not obligated to share it. And once it's drunk, it's not available to others. So it meets classically that definition of a private goods. But again, it's not always so clear cut. Next slide, please. We have what has been called impure or quasi public goods. And in our book and in our different writings on this, we speak at length about the different types of public goods. And these impure or quasi public goods have characteristics of public goods, but they may be rivalrous or exclusive, but some can, and here we make note here, semi-non-rival goods. May be a park, it may be a beach road, or it may be a public service in nature. So you want to go to the park, but there's a fee to get into the park. We find it in beaches in this country as well as in other areas. And this includes both state parks and federal parks and county parks that you'll find. And it's a way of controlling usages. You'll find roads. Roads generally are regarded as for the public and people can drive on the roads. However, some roads, if you want to drive and you may get quicker to point A to point B, well, there will be a cost for that particular road. That would be thought of as this quasi public goods. Beaches, just as well. You may pay a fee for beaches that you want to attend or to go to. But let's move on and let's talk about this business and the contribution of business, which is the other theme of our book that we talked about. Next slide, please. When we talk about business, and historically, when you think of business, I think it was Calvin Coolidge who made the statement, he's a 30th president of the United States, business is in the business of business. And that's what they're concerned with. Charlie Wilson, former CEO of General Motors, made the statement that what's good for General Motors is good for America. And so it was always believed, or at least for many, many years, it was believed that business should operate, they should maximize their profit, and that is good for the community, for the nation, for all participants at large. Milton Friedman, Nobel Prize economist, said the social responsibility of business is to increase its profit and to maximize shareholder value. I put that down as what I believe is to be an old belief or an old covenant of sorts. And Peter Drucker was really foremost leader in business consulting and business education. He broached this whole idea of this new covenant for business, or at least what I would call a new covenant.
Like I was.
Well, okay, new covenant. And by that, Drucker said, an organization is not an end in itself. An organization is an organ of society and fulfills itself by the contribution it makes to the outside environment. So there is a connectivity to business, to the greater world, the greater community out there. Next slide, please. This new role of business, and especially looking at one looks at would be the provisions of more public services or a public greater responsibility. We've seen it over the last decade, if not longer, and we see it in new streams of research, books that are written, articles that have been written, as well as the activity of companies that we've seen. Moral capitalism. When we talk about moral capitalism, we talked about this whole idea to be inclusive with business, to improve people's lives. That's one of the purposes of capitalism. John Mackey, former CEO of Whole Food, and Raj Sisodia, one of the authors of Firms of Endearment, talks about this idea of, we need to help other people, this conscious sense, and this business leaders need to create a sense of humanity in business, that business can be different in how it does it. Muhammad Yunus, he speaks of a world without poverty, bringing different people from different economic stratas into the market. And of course, one would say, that increases your customer base, but what it does, it becomes more inclusive to include all people into the business arrangement. And of course, as I said, we see it companies, Patagonia, Whole Foods, Tom's, other ones. And well, we only hope that Whole Foods can still continue with effort to be an example of a good company now that it's owned by Amazon. Next slide, please. And this idea of business and their responsibility has really taken an institutional focus. We see it with the Academy of Management, speaking of the greater role of business, corporate social responsibility. A few years ago, there was a conference, Inclusive Capitalism, and at the conference, and it was attended by business leaders as well as other world leaders, and they spoke to the importance of bringing all people into the process of capitalism. There is, I think many of you are aware of it, that many people are questioning the validity of capitalism as an operational system. And it is a system that we have. And it needs to include people, involve people. And of course, if we want to sustain ourselves in the future, then all parties have to be involved. So businesses moving beyond just corporate responsibility, social, environmental, economical, needs to move forward. Next slide, please. Chris Laszlo, for example, he talks of, yes, you have a responsibility with sustainability, but there's a greater responsibility. He calls it this new spirit of business enterprises. And not only do you look externally at sustaining and improving, and being part of the greater community, but you have a responsibility to, and what he calls flourishing, that those individuals that work within an organization have passion and give of themselves, and that they're all part of this greater good. So some would call it very idealistic, but it's definitely an optimistic way of looking at how businesses can change and really very much how they can develop. Next slide, please. What I find one of the greatest books on, this new movement, this new way of looking at business, this new attitude towards business, a sense of this consciousness with business, is Firms of Endearment. And in Firms of Endearment, it talks historically that we had more of a shareholder or stockholder model. And that is an old model. And again, that part of that old covenant. The new covenant is a stakeholder model. And it's looking broadly at all participants, those in the community, those that work for you, those that are outside your given areas, that this is all part of what you do as a business. Next slide, please. And, when he talks about, and I just put some of the characteristics up that are talked about in Firms of Endearment, but business needs a purpose beyond just solely money. That there is that sense of doing good. When you look at your stakeholders, it's all parties that are involved with it. Believing that benefits, giving benefits to individuals that work at the corporations, that are associated with the corporations, is essential and part of your role within a business. Now, what have been found is with such businesses, there's less turnover. You find more passionate individuals, working for it. More of a humanizing customer experience. The people that work with you, the various suppliers, they are looked at as partners and collaborators, and that ultimately, by these processes, you're changing the culture of the business and who you work for. And again, many businesses are assuming this, but backing up, businesses, going back to Calvin Coolidge, businesses in the business of business, and one has to, yes, show a profit. So is this new way, this new approach, profitable? Next slide, please. This was looked at with firms of endearment, firms that were identified as, having the characteristics of those as described in the book, Firms of Endearment, and the S&P 500. And when it was looked at over a period of years, what it found was that firms of endearment outperformed the S&P 500. Goldman Sachs said, we believe that companies with sustainable business practices are better managed, more innovative, less risky, better positioned to deliver superior performance over the long term. Next slide, please. Another study that was done looking at the firms of endearment was comparing them on a 3-year, 5-year, 10-year, and 15-year period. And they looked at the S&P 500, and they also looked at good to great companies. Good to great companies are companies that were identified having what Jim Collins, who wrote a book called the same title, Good to Great, certain characteristics that how they moved over a 30-year period from good to great. So when we compare the FOE companies to good to great companies and the S&P, they outperformed them 14 times over a good to great period and 6 times over the good to great companies. So what one is doing is the businesses, they're having maybe comparable returns on investment on the short term, but in the long term, they achieve much more market positioning and much greater profit. So the theme is, or the sum of this is, that it's good for business to think of the greater community and the greater group out there. Next slide, please. Eccles did a study on the impact of corporate sustainability on organizational processes and performance. A study of 180 companies from 1993 to 2009. He looked at 90 high sustainability companies versus 90 low sustainability companies. And he looked across a whole range of measures. And if we take a look at it, we can see that those that were high sustainability outperformed those with lower sustainability. Next slide. Roger Martin, Michael Porter, Christopher Myers, and others has said that, historically, this idea to maximize shareholders' value, it in itself resulted in a myopic perspective on management. This idea of looking at short-term gains is, in the long term, not going to be profitable. Yes, you may have returns on the short term, but if you want to sustain yourself, if you want to perform well, then you need, or at least businesses need to have this much more greater perspective and broader perspective with it. Next slide. And what we found from this is that there has become new models of businesses, public benefit corporations, where written into their charter, codified into their operating principles, is this whole idea of that we the business have a greater responsibility and a greater role in providing for others and working with others. So the way to success is, and we talk about, at length in our book, is to look at the role of business and how it has contributed to, or how it's necessary for it to contribute to the greater goods of society. And again, I have to emphasize, after COVID, I think it has truly highlighted the role of the private sector into the public sector and how these different groups mesh together. But let's move on to the next theme of our book, which is sustainable development. And I'm going to pass that on to Rowan.
Thank you. If you stay with this slide, we read one very nice sentence: businesses can achieve this, meaning business interests, and virtues, meaning doing good for the society, in their normal operations. And that would take us to the next slide, please, where we have in the middle what James Coolidge said: businesses are in the business of business. Well, so if they do their business properly in their normal processes, they will do what is good for them and what is due publicly. What is publicly good, we are playing with the word public good and public goods. And the value systems which Arthur has explained are moral capitalism, sustainable leadership, sufficiency, economy, philosophy. So I have a nice friend in Australia who wrote a book where he talks about scarcity. And he said there is no scarcity. Economic theory is full of scarcity, but there is so much less than scarcity, or there is a surplus in our world, but we have to make use of this. So sufficiency instead of scarcity, and a recognition that when you want to increase your ROI and your economic sustainability, it will only be possible, and this relates us to the public goods theme now, that you integrate the public good and the public goods, because any of the firms in the world cannot do without using public goods, meaning what Arthur explained, the environment, the rivers, the nature, the social infrastructure. That is all public goods, and without these, no company can do their business. So, and we all know that according to Brundtland, sustainability and sustainable development is about the future. So let us go to the next slide with this term of sustainability. Go Brundtland, meeting the needs of the present generation without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their needs. This was way back in 1987, and it's still worth now. An interesting other definition is by Robert Costanza, who said, we have to relate human economic development with the systems who are not as fast in their ability to change, like the ecological systems. And if we can relate, or we can balance these, we will continue with flourishing and developing or maintaining our human cultures. So that is a definition of sustainability, which is very important. And if you go to the next slide, you will see that all this is connected to the United Nations 2030 Agenda, Sustainable Development Goals. And I'm here in Germany. I always used to tell my German friends, when they talk about sustainable development, they talk about goal 13, climate action. And they march in the streets and whatever. And there are just 14 more or 16 more goals, which are often neglected. And I think we have still a little time. We are in the middle. We are not yet in the middle. But my other story is I was in Ghana to help a small college to become active in the northeastern territory, way away from the capital, from my friends there or the new people I met knew about Kofi Annan because he was Ghanaian. So when we took them into this topic, poor people who had never known anything else but their little village, and we said we had a picture which was a little different. It was like a tree where you have all the fruit, and there was security on the streets, there was water, there was sanitations, and they would say, well, this is affecting ourselves. Well, we have water and sanitation and food and jobs in the developed world, but not perfectly. So it's not that it's just one goal which is dominant, even though it's very important, but there are 16 more goals. And that's what we want to show. Each of these goals, if you go on with the slide, please. Each of these SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, represents one or more public goods. Like we have peace, we have institutional base of a country, we have air, we have water, we have clean oceans. So if this is the case, next slide, please. If each of the SDGs represents one or more public goods, then one could say measuring progress of the SDG, which is done by national reports, by a lot of things that are in the making between CSOs and United Nations agencies. But there would be another way also measuring progress of SDG implementation can be termed as measuring if the amount and the value of a certain public good has increased and not at least not decreased. So that's where we connect the SDG topic to the sustainable development topic. The issue then is if you talk about measuring, you are more or less urged or tempted at least to go into assigning a monetary value to a public good. And here you clash with all the people who are what they call opponents of commodifying nature and commodifying public goods, because then it will be for sale. Well, if you want to measure and if you above all, if you want to aggregate values, you need a monetary value. Well, I was accountant in business. When I talk about this, it's my world, and there are a lot of techniques around already. It's about cost benefit of, for instance, what is the cost benefit of a public park? It's about rent capitalization. What is better, having a forest for delight of the people, or a forestation that gives a rent in terms of wood. Then you have input-output matrices and flow measurement of what is the price of having less pollution. And then you have contingency evaluation, where you ask people, would you be willing to pay for such and such public good? And if not, why don't you? So willingness to pay or willingness to not pay. So there are methods around, but they are not around for all public goods. And it's a big challenge for the statistical offices in the world to do more in that respect. I have a very nice friend by the name of Anthony Friend, who was one of the inventors of ecological accounting. He's in Ottawa. He worked for the statistical office there. So I know this is a topic where we could talk years, or we could talk hours, and it will take years to accomplish an improvement. But it's where I think you cannot get out of the circle without doing this monetary exercise. Next slide, please. So the good thing is, when we do about environment and nature, as I said, there is rent, capitalization, cost, benefit, willingness to pay. But what about the other social, the social public goods, the social capital? Can you measure here? Can you really do a comparison in monetary or index terms between, let me say, the social value that is inherent in a specific neighborhood, like in Manhattan, and compare this to a remote village in Wisconsin? So social public goods, as opposed to natural public goods, seem to be much less tangible. And indeed they are, but there are methodologies. If you go to the next slide, please. The World Bank is on the next slide. Oh no, this is one step before. So if we all talk about monetization and valuation, here comes an old but still strong controversy, which says, if you talk about the nature and biodiversity, this is the lower part of the slide, you have to keep it intact and maintain what is around here, because nature is indivisible and you cannot do commodification. I said this before. But this denies that the value of the environment can be expressed in money, and then we have an end where you don't go any further, because if you say this, there is no discussion. On the other hand is what is called the weak sustainability, where you say, well, some of our natural capital, and you look about all the dams which have been built in America, and there are, starting with the Hoover Dam, and now in Itaipu in South America, which produces, the dam is 280 meters high. So we have always replaced natural capital by man-made capital. And then if you have man-made capital, you have work hours and salaries and input, and here you are with valuation. So that's the problem. The constant capital rule, which I have in the title of the slide, says that you have to maintain the capital of your environment on an even level. Well, that's true, but that doesn't mean that you cannot change the structure of the environment, and that's what the opponents of weak sustainability argue against. Next slide, please. From this constant capital concept, we can still reconcile those two issues of sustainability. There have been a lot of I gave these names, and I have them in the end. At the end of the presentation, we have the sources. They're all attempts to connect sustainability measuring with what we do in the microeconomic world or in the business world. And in the middle of the slide, there is the various attempts of making companies report on what they do to be sustainable within and without their boundaries. And one could say, well, in the economic world, we have the concept of economic value added, which is the difference between the profit and the cost of capital. And this is about the capital which is in the books of a company. But if you add the the capital which is tied up in public goods that are used by the company, as I said, infrastructure, society, labor market, societal achievements like a good working labor market, law system. This is all public goods which are used. So this also has to be earned by the public, by any of the firms making a profit. My big boss in BASF said to me, but we pay taxes. And I said to him, look, and if you don't have a profit, we still use public goods and we don't pay taxes. So it's not about paying taxes. It's about showing what is the input which is used, next slide, please, by a firm in its usage of resources. And there is that social capital, and the World Bank has done a definition. It's mainly about relations, diversity, and they have discontinued in the late 1900s, because this is not really measurable. I have a friend who was, next slide please, who was a scholar of the famous Elinor Ostrom, Stanford professor, who started with commons and public goods. We also come back to this term, commons, public goods. And he said, well, if you ask people in Mexico, Ukraine, Tanzania, Vietnam about what they think about politics, about government measures, about if there is too much taxation, what is the value of their assets, trust, you can have an index which is by village, because it is different by village. And this is really expressing the basic networking. So we say, well, for that to happen, you have, and on the right-hand side, trust and solidarity, collective action, social cohesion. This is what the social capital indicators are by the World Bank definition. You have to have a base. You have to have institutional and government capital. You have to have a foundation. Otherwise, you cannot start with collective action and trust and solidarity. Next slide, please. There are quite, I would say, a myriad of indexes. If you look at the variables on the right-hand side of the slide, 1100 in the Living Planet Index and the more well-being index. There are a lot of indices. The only thing is mainly the variables cannot be aggregated to a numeric value, but it's there. And if I may go to the next slide, this friend in Basel, scholar of Elinor Ostrom, he said, well, why don't we do it in an accounting way? We have various classes of goods where we can really have a metric and a database for natural resources, for social resources, and then it goes on. And this is what he termed to be the Swiss National Commons product. I must admit that the Swiss Statistical Office never went about this, but it's at least an attempt to show what could be done to show what is the value that is used by the corporations when they are exercising their business and using public goods. To the next slide, please, because this is what would connect from the inner perspective of a firm, where the objective is certainly to have as much capital at the end of the year as when you started. It's capital maintenance. And on the other hand, when we talk about the capital theory of sustainability economics, the same thing. We have to maintain a constant natural capital stock. We have to get a stream of output. but we must not deplenish this. So this is the relation when we talk of capital. And if I may see the next slide, that is inherent in the Integrating Reporting Initiative, which was founded, among others, by His Highness Prince Charles of Wales, where he said, and we all know he is very close to natural and environment. He has a very nice book, which is called Harmony. And in this book, he talks about the multiple capitals. So it's not that the capital term is away from nature and social coherence. And in this reporting system, which is promoted by the Integrating Reporting Initiative, we have finance, manufacturer, but we have intellectual, human, social, and natural, which all are entering into the value creation process. So multiple capitals, and I switch to the next slide, which will now lead us to Licia, who will take over when I'm done with this. Pierce and Atkinson were two of the creators of sustainable value concepts, sustainability concepts, and they also talk about multiple assets. Not really capital, but I put it here. Pierce said, when you look at the household level, the community level, the national level, you have physical assets on all of these, you have financial assets on all of these, you have human assets, and you have environmental and social assets. All these are available for mankind and businesses to thrive and to make use of this. And Licia will now take over. We have 4 examples, very well worked out examples about education. I know it will be Raymond, it will be Arthur first.
I will talk first.
Education, schools, hospitals, health, and water. Water is not with a red dot, but it should be with a yellow dot. So education, health, and water as a good example of public goods and how they are standing in the environment of our life. Thank you, Arthur. For the next slide, please, Nigel.
Yeah, thank you very much, Rowan. And, you know, as Rowan presented earlier, he talked about the Sustainable Development Goals and the 17 goals that are there. And, you know, and again, we'll just very briefly speak to a few of them, and I'll talk to the whole idea of education as a public goal. And this is goal number 4 for quality education in the SDGs. And it reads, ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifelong learning opportunities for all. And by that, make education available for all people, make it free, make it equitable, make it quality education. And when we talk about education, we're talking primary, secondary, but we're also talking about vocational and technical education. Those things that can lead people to very productive, we'll say, jobs and benefits like that. Important and inherent to it is removing disparities, you know, in particular gender disparities when we look at education. If we look at 4.7, it's a lofty goal in nature, but a very important one. Ensure that all learners acquire the knowledge and skills needed to promote sustainable development, sustainable lifestyle, human rights, gender equality, culture of peace, nonviolence, global citizenship, appreciation of cultural diversity. A mouthful, we would say. The university, and Rowan mentioned that I'm at Florida Gulf Coast University, and he was an executive professor there. Part of their curriculum when they started was to have a class, they called it colloquium. And that colloquium class was to instill in students an understanding of those life skills, so sustainable, the importance of the environment in which they live and the appreciation of human rights, which, again, from an educational institution, in line with what SDG number 4 speaks about. In order to provide the education, you're going to have to upgrade and build new facilities for those that can access and those that maybe have difficult accessing it. And concurrent with that is, of course, providing scholarships for education so people can have the availability of it, and to help teachers and to promote an environment where, teachers can be there. Next slide, please. When we talk about education as a public good, we look at, of course, the last year and COVID and what is the results of COVID over this last year. Now, prior to COVID, when we looked at education, the stats are saying over 200 million children will still be without schools. Post-COVID, it's had a dramatic impact on education. Those of you who have children, know people with children, know that schools were closed. Children had to access education remotely, which of course requires technology in order to do it. And I think what it did was, well, a couple things. What COVID did was push educational institutions to adopt and to integrate technology faster than they would have ever done. And they had to do it very, very rapidly indeed. But also what it did was it highlighted the inequities to those that could access it, that had the resources, software, the hardware, the ability, the connectivity to do it. And of course, so many that did not. Educational theorists and administrators speak of the impact of COVID on the educational environment. Now, of course, there's a lot of talk about the mental health, but it's also the academic health of those individuals to learn has been, impacted with it when we look at it. But what I would say, and I believe very strongly that the changes of the integration of technology into the educational environment is a public good. It's here to stay. And the approach to education will change dramatically. When we talk of pandemics, and of course, pandemics have been going since earliest times, they always leave in their wake dramatic changes. We have yet to see all the changes that will occur, but there will be dramatic changes to the educational environment as a result of COVID. And most definitely the need, the aspect of technology will become increasingly, as I said earlier, a greater role, which means that the role of the educator will change as a result of it. Very importantly with that, when we talk of education, we talk of academic learning, but in order to operate successfully in the world, you have to have life skills. And those life skills, those future skills, they too will be called for as we look at this goal number 4 and education. Next slide, please. So the concept of education as a public good, when we look at it in the primary and secondary, it's largely non-rivalrous and non-exclusive in nature. When we look at higher education and vocational and technical education, it's rivalrous in nature. There's often many private entities to it, and it's non-exclusive based upon various nations' policies. Something I've seen as a business professor, over these years, and more recently, AACSB, the Association to Advance Collegiate Schools of Business, which is a premier association for business schools, has really looked and said with business education, it will change. And they've codified and written into their visions different changes for the varied business schools that are AACSB certified. And they put forward 5 key opportunities for school to add value, to create market, to differentiate themselves, but very importantly, that business education needs to serve society globally in a different way. They go on to say the business schools need to be catalysts of innovations, co-creators of knowledge, hubs of lifelong learning. So, and we speak to this so strongly when we talk about knowledge and knowledge management, that knowledge will be the skill that will separate us in the future as we move forward in the future. And the idea that different individuals, the millennium generations and Generation X and so forth, that they will have to reinvent themselves because of the fast pace of technology. So this idea that they will continuously have to learn will become part of the educational milieu, the educational environment that we live in. And of course, with that, there needs to be, and we see it in Europe, and it needs to be much more in America and other places in the world, the type partnerships that need to develop with education institutions and the different organizations or the different businesses out there. In the same way, when we look at addressing sustainable development and different events that happen in the world, those global problems we speak of, it is also, it's key that there's partnerships involved between the private and the public sector. And that too needs to be part and parcel of the education, the role of education. But anyway, I just wanted to talk briefly about that. And I do want to turn it over to talk about another SDG goal, which is water. And we'll move over to my colleague, Ramon Senior, to talk about that.
And may I ask Ramon to present himself and his big achievements in Geneva and the world, so we know about you a little more?
Well, just very briefly, it's a pleasure to be with you, with my colleagues who have been already presenting, as well, of course, with the people who are listening and are also interested in the topic of public goods. I'm here in Geneva. I'm co-founder of a center called Center for Socioeconomic Development, which was created 27 years ago by also Li Jia, my spouse and partner, and you will hear her speak right after me. Well, 27 years ago, we already thought about the need to think in an interdisciplinary, intersectoral manner, which is to look at social, environmental, as well as, of course, economic development, that there are interlinkages and one cannot simply imagine things as if there were silos, but that was, in fact, this is what the SDGs are all about, the 3 dimensions, economic, social, and environmental dimension of sustainable development. So basically, we've been looking at this for some time, and it is an important topic. We very much care about this, and we're happy to share the knowledge that we have now also created together with our 2 colleagues, Roland and Arthur. So let me take one classic case of a public good, which often is the source of open conflict. We need water to survive. That's a platitude. But at the same time, we also know water can be scarce. Those who have access to water can survive. There have been wars fought over water, rivers, sources. So it will continue to be a very important issue and a source of conflict that should ideally be solved through a sensible form of sharing, where in fact access to water, we are not dealing here with a non-exclusive, non-rivalrous public good. It could be that some people are prevented from having access to water. It could be some people are asked to pay very high prices per liter, which excludes them from getting access to affordable water. You see, so the potential of discord, even war, is very high. And we have, in that sense, several targets that were negotiated by the countries which have come up with the Sustainable Development Goals. And these targets are based on the understanding that we have to structure access to water in a way that will not lead to conflict. So a lot of what you see, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, and further on the next slide, are simply good intentions and suggestions what to do to avoid fights over water. And the next slide, please. It just basically means, as I already said before, there are lots of people who don't have adequate access to water, neither to sufficient quantity of water, nor to quality of good enough quality of water, water that's either poisonous or could lead to all sorts of illnesses if not treated. So that is highlighted here. It's been studied. We know it is not equitable. It is based on doing as much as we can to improve who should be given access to water. Should all the water go to industry, and the industry produces whatever it produces, but doesn't take care of cleaning up the water that it has been used, but instead just dumps it into public rivers, causing damage to fisheries or causing illnesses of the people who live along the rivers, which have been received poisonous water. So you see on these slides, the situation is not good. There really has to be done much by our governments, but also by society and the different partners, being business and society and neighbors, how to sensibly use water today, but also to do the best to make sure that the next generation will have sufficient and affordable water. Next one. So how to provide water? There can be different solutions, and we should, take all this into considerations rather than be handicapped by maybe ideological preferences. In some countries, the idea of water provision means, oh, this should be privatized. Only if it's in the hands of a company which has to generate profits in order to survive, they know how to cut costs or at least avoid too many costs or too high of a costs, and to get as much revenue by giving it to a public or to a market that ensures paying high prices for the water they produce. Well, I'm exaggerating, but there are these different views as to who should do the job to provide water. And as you see on this table here, it could be done by public enterprises. It could be done through private companies. It could be done through a public-private partnership, Or it also, in some countries, it could be done by a cooperative, which is a group of people who co-own an organization which produces goods or services. Now, very briefly, to give you an example how this should be really thought through carefully. There was a project in Bolivia for the people at the high altiplano. They live at altitudes of 4,000 meters, indigenous people, and often cut off from water supply. So the saying is, the road to hell is paved by good intention. The idea then was, through technical cooperation, something could be done to improve the pipes, the water pipes, the irrigation. So from the glaciers, the water could be brought to the villages of the Altiplano. Well, that is an investment. So the technical cooperation by the country was the donor had to agree that the investor, which is a big company, a water management company from Europe, that they would be given a fixed return on investment. They would be entitled to get, I think it was 10% return on investment. For them, that meant they would install counters for each household. So depending on how much water they consumed, they would at the same time have to pay up for the consumption of it, which clashed with the belief of these indigenous people that water is just simply given by the gods and should be freely available, which as a religious belief, that's one thing. But from a sustainability perspective, of course, this led to enormous waste. The water was wasted and is missing already today, as well as it will be missed tomorrow. So there had to be a much better reflection and negotiation between the company, the water company, which installed the irrigation system, as well as the leaders from the local communities, to get them to agree not to waste water makes sense, but to find an equitable manner of or formula to share the water that's being provided through the new irrigation system. So just to close, that's one of the things to, when we talk about the public good, such as water, which is very conflictual, very important for the survival of our societies, the different stakeholders who use water, who need water, we have to help them come up with a solution that's sustainable. Next one. I think, am I next or no, that's you, Lija.
Well, thank you. I can see that you are fully in the steam. But say a few words about myself. As Ramon already mentioned, that we are co-founder of a small NGO based in Geneva. And personally, that I'm specializing in organizational studies and organizational change, and have done for the last 30 years big or small reform projects of the public sector. And health is one of my favorite topics, because how to achieve health for all, or good health for all, is very important, especially in today's world, when no matter where you are, most of the time life expectancy has been improved, and people could live, if health holds up, quite interesting and productive and life. So health as a public good is a very difficult topic. The reason for that is because it's by nature intersectoral. It's affected by the level of income, by the access to nutritious and good food. One example is that when the Berlin Wall broke down, and also when the former USSR countries sort of gaining independence, and they could start freely travel. Just from the body type, in terms of the weight, you could almost detect where are they coming from. And this is because, and since the last 20 years, you could see that has been modified and changed. So health is a issue which is really depending on many many other factors. And many of these factors, like what Ramon just talked about, water, we're talking about access to land and also for agriculture and also for the decent work. These are all things that will result in good or bad health. And I have picked out some of the targets and from the SDG 3, talking about good health and well-being for all. And in that case, I think 3.8, talking about some of the basic provision which is coming into the public policy, considering universal health coverage. The basic health services or access to services should not be determined by the income level, because many countries, they do not have the basic social protection, and they also oftentimes also face lack of employment opportunities. So in some countries, actually quite a few developing countries and least developed countries, more than 50% of the population probably in their whole lifetime will not have one formalized employment. And that in principle, the precarity of their life is very much exaggerated or exasperated by lack of good health or health protection. And the second thing is, I think, is very necessary to talk about the health issue is really looking at the social and environmental determinants of health. And so when living in an environment that is no acceptable drinking water and no toilet, no solid waste treatment, and all this environmental pollution is posing great hazards for good health. And therefore, and since we are speaking that health is oftentimes results from other necessary inputs, we have to start thinking about health as a public good in a much more integrated manner. As a matter of fact, of the SDG 17 goals, it is very much connected and interdependent on the other goals before the good health and well-being could truly achieve for everybody and leave no one behind. And by this nature, when the discussion about public goods become and provision and guarantee of public services become important, and it ties in very nicely and very closely with SDG 16 when we talk about the strong, robust public institutions to ensure a fair and just society. And I'd like to sort of highlight these 3.7, saying it talks about financing, and also in terms of the development, training, and retention of the health worker. The irony is that the poor countries spend their very valuable resources to an elite who could access to higher education, and on top of that, access to medical school and the medical training. But at the end of the day, out of an individual choice, what we tend to see is that these highly valuable health services and needed personnel tend to leave the country. And so the brain drain is also causing a lot of issue. However, how to sort of encourage and support the return of these valuable human assets back to the country, back to where they are most needed, it's not an easy discussion. So health is also links to other policies and also at the global level, linking, connected to the opportunity for individual development. Next page, please. When we speak of health, we're not speaking health in a vacuum. We are also looking at the basic infrastructure, which it could be policy, and physical infrastructure, which could be a health clinic. It is not unusual when we travel to some of the poorest countries of the world, that when you poke your head into the so-called the pharmacy within a health facility, one can see empty shelves. There's no medicine. And when you go into a room that it says the surgical room, and then you see a little pot on the floor and supposedly to be heated in order to sanitize the medical instruments being used, such as needles. These are oftentimes the conditions that we have seen. And so when we talk about health in many of the difficult, challenging circumstances, we're talking about a different kind of public goods, which is more educational, which is more about environmental conditions. So the discussion about primary health care is to move public health concept from a treatment, medical treatment, to much more about a health education and healthy lifestyle of type of prevention. And so if you look at this, then you can consider the difficulties that one tend to have, because that means that we need many more frontline service to provide public health education. We need to have people who help others to understand the importance of, having toilet, having, sort of not mixing, the liquid waste with the water sources. And these kind of things are, very difficult to do when the general educational level or, the circumstances is difficult. If we look at, the health coverage at this moment, according to the UN, in 2017, only around 1/3 or half of the global population was covered by essential health services. That will go from vaccination at the early childhood to some of the sort of a regular health checkup. And if this trend continues, only 39 to 63% of the global population will be covered by essential health services by 2030. In other words, we are seeing this disparity between different parts of the world. On the one hand, we see more and more people in the advanced societies and also middle income societies. Life is getting, expectancy is getting longer. The healthy life expectancy is also getting longer, while the other places continue to lag behind. And next, please. So I wanted to conclude by looking at some of the management practices and make some suggestions. Improving, one is about providing better working conditions. And most importantly is livable wage or living wage. Because you can see some places the overall salary that's being paid to the people actually creates a class of individuals living with precarity and and continue sort of stuck in this living poor category because they do not earn enough to have extras, either to put aside to save for rainy days or to use that for further education and self-development, or even just cultural exposure and entertainment. And the second thing, I think we need to look at public spaces, how to reduce occupational hazard, health risks by improving the environment in general. And the third one is education and organize regular sport programs, for example. But I wanted to also suggest, new possibilities that we are working on at the moment. It's about making the working place also possibility for managing the transition to an older life. Because we know that the older people by 2050 would outpace the sort of the birth of and total number of the young people. So how do we contribute to this transition? And so that the demographic bonus will be indeed a blessing, not a curse. And I think companies could do many more in this regard. And the last one is CSR measures. And so sports, making the working environment healthy and more psychologically less stressful, and also to support the families for a more healthy and lifestyle. These are the things could be done, and without necessarily adding a lot of cost. Seeing that many people working for the companies are interested to get engaged in the community and to provide more socially oriented services through taking time out. And I think, these CSR measures could also help contributing to the health of all people in the community. Thank you. I hand it back to Raymond to talk about peace.
In the interest of time, let me be short. What you have here on the slide lists up the different elements of our life that already Roland was talking about in terms of how to measure or how to provide metrics to understand what is there to be shared or what is there in that sense to be part of the public goods. And what you have here on the list are, for instance, the physical assets, financial assets, human assets, environmental and social assets, which are as such part of public goods. The question is, as you see it in the three columns, you have households who have physical assets, be it animals or tools or just the building that they're living in, but they also have money, hopefully a lot, but depending on what is available, the financial assets are limited or the family is more at ease. These are basically the concepts of the different assets here are given by household, by community level, and also at the national country level. So this gives us a better basis to then rethink and discuss how to share public goods. Next one. Now, a classic case of a big issue that we're here in Geneva are negotiating now and have been negotiating for quite some months already. And it's a very, very conflictual item about fishing, the fishery. The fishery sector, as most of you know, we have the dilemma that some countries, the governments heavily subsidize the fishing boats of their national fishermen. Well, if you subsidize, you're surviving, you're in business, and they go out into the oceans and do their business, which is to fish. However, because so many are out there fishing, and some from other countries even go out with big boats that are like factory boats, where the fish being caught is immediate, that's all processed, and at the end comes out already something that could be close to put on the market as processed food here, processed fish. So we have overfishing, the efficiency, which is so much a big issue or a big concern in management. Of course, it's important to be efficient in what you produce. But at the macro level, we have to ask ourselves, what do we do if we're too efficient? Meaning, if we have too many fishing boats getting the fish back and depleting the stock, which means that the next generation will have less fish to fish for. So we try to negotiate and come up with a solution that the country should not over-subsidize the fishing industry and to be more mindful about some of the fish which are at the risk of already disappearing, to protect them. That's one big issue, and they haven't found a solution yet. The other one is who works on these ships. And it's considered to be one of the remaining industry in particularly Southeast Asia, where the working conditions are appalling. A lot of times migrants are picked up to work on these ships in inhumane working conditions. They're really treated a bit like slaves, and some are even get as punishment if they don't comply with the captain's wishes or have been thrown overboard. I'm not exaggerating. This is published reports about the conditions of work on some of these fishing boats. So we got to clean that up. And one of these ways to do it is to collaborate. One country alone cannot do this job because the boats fish in international waters. So sometimes they go simply to the country and to the harbor, which is the least regulated, where basically they can do whatever they want to do, which is, of course, no solution for the future. So we have to find ways to get the countries who compete for investment, who compete for fishing or the fishing industry, to have at least a minimum understanding to make sure that the working conditions and the overfishing stops so that we can build a better future together. Next one. Now, when it comes to population, I think that was already mentioned before by my colleagues. The estimations vary, but at the moment, if we don't have a major additional catastrophe, such as war, the population will continue to increase. Even with COVID-19, the trend is for more people to be put on this planet Earth, which of course then means also to think about how this trend will impact food supply, living conditions, health, conflict over water. We are very challenged to anticipate potential additional conflicts, and we should, in that sense, also be challenged to look for solutions ahead of potential conflicts to come. Next one. So when you see these pictures of the happy people at the beach, especially now after COVID-19, we could all sympathize with them to finally get to go and swim a bit and have fun together, which is true. That's wonderful. But we also have the other picture on the right side of the overcrowded trains. For instance, in India, the people are on top of the train, on the sides of the train. The infrastructure is falling apart. But it's not just the poor living conditions and the poor transportation systems. We have to think about population growth means more consumption, more people to be fed. And SDG, the SDG that looks at consumption is crucial, which says we should find a way to organize our societies and us as individuals in a much more sensible way. So we could live a life based on sustainable lifestyles, and we could also produce the goods that are being produced by our industry or by our agriculture that is the least polluting and generates the least of negative externalities, so we can ensure the survival of the planet, which also, of course, includes the survival of us and of our societies. Next one. Now, food security is again a topic that's being discussed. The prices have gone up. On the average, up to 30% price increase of essential food commodities. So far, it didn't lead to food scarcity, but it might. And we had food crisis before, which led to the discussion about food security. What can we do in terms of organizing our agricultural production in a sustainable and sensible and equitable manner. There is an overall agreement among the experts to say we can produce enough food for the current world population. However, the problem occurs when the sharing, the distribution of what is being produced is biased based on income, based on access, then we have a problem. But the problem is not necessarily the production of food on the farms. It is what is being produced. What do we do with the food production? And we're now discussing, again, how could we avoid what might happen soon if the COVID-19 crisis continues, that we have people that need to be taken care of also in terms of food, because not enough farmers will produce agricultural products. Then it can get to the problem that some countries who are exporters of food, be it rice, wheat, or other food products or agricultural products, decide to stop exporting food. And this has caused havoc in the countries who are food importers, who need to be able to buy and to get food from those countries which produce excess food. And if they are stopped from being able to sell and to export to other countries, the ones that are depending on food will be in deep crisis. So these are, you see, other things to discuss that were to make it clear that food is an essential public good. But the production and the distribution of these essential goods of food, that's the thing that we should be more clear about, how to avoid conflicts, crises, and suffering from the people who don't get access to food. Next one. So the food security issue is at the same time local as well as a global or regional issue. Meaning here, we have, for instance, food commodities. We did a study recently on coffee, cacao, and nutmeg. Now, the issue is if it's produced by the least developed countries, meaning the poorest of the family of countries. For instance, we have a lot of LDCs in Africa, but also in Asia. Well, they have, in general, all the good conditions to produce agricultural products. However, once the beautiful fruits fall off the tree, so to speak, the question is, you have to be able to rush and do something with these goods. Otherwise they perish. So they have to figure out a way how to maybe do some processing to make sure that the food that's harvested gets to be to reach a consumer, gets to be sent to markets where the food products are appreciated and needed. All these steps mean additional know-how. Knowing how to dry coffee beans, for instance, knowing how to process them, knowing how to package food that's been harvested. That means there's a need for capital, a need for know-how, a need for technology, need for roads to bring the goods. And that aspect is very important to ensure that both the producers, the farmers, and those who receive the food are in a form of harmony, or at least are both benefiting from food production. Next one. I think, I'm not sure, is this still me or is this now for you, Roland?
This would be on me.
All right.
My name was written there, but it's not here. Well, what Alicia and Raymond talked about is issues that affect all mankind. And the question is, all mankind means there have to be global collective efforts. And who better can enable these efforts than United Nations organizations like the World Trade Organization? I have here what they have in their mission statement, and UNCTAD, I have here what they have in their mission statement. And if you take one example, back to the seashore and the waters, we all know about the pollution of global seashores with plastic waste, and there are people who are thinking what they can do, but they need to have enablers, and this would be one example I put here: Caribbean program, Arctic regional program, both backed by a commission that was established in Paris, and all these types of international organizations can help, but there have to be initiatives on the local side. Next slide, please, which is also about provision of finance. One thing is enabling through know-how and agents who are knowledgeable and on the ground, but the other one is providing access to the agriculture. Raymond talked about this. I found an interesting example on the poor farmers, which we all see in television all the time in China, Myanmar, and Vietnam. And now we have the contribution of business again, investments funds and businesses who bring new ideas and new capital to make a difference. Which brings me to the next, next slide, please. What is to be avoided in all these issues? Mahmoud Moheldin was always in this field, and he is now the special envoy on financing the 2030 agenda. And he says we have to deal with joblessness, we have to cut fiscal deficits, we have to do things in the old way. No. This is what we have to avoid. We cannot just cut fiscal deficit by sacrificing public investment. We cannot impose administrative price controls, like Raymond said in the agriculture. We have to stop by ignoring environmental implications. So there is a lot of warnings and things that have to be taken into account. Next slide, please, because we want to give the floor to the audience. And when we are talking about organizations like the World Trade Organization or UNCTAD, we talk about institutions, and that means if you work together in such an institutions, and if you have private-public partnerships, if you let in the participation of civil society organizations, you have to have some sort of governance and organization, rules for division of work, accountability. And one of the issues I'm mentioning is provided or is taken account of in SDG 17. The goal 17 says we have to partner we have to establish partnerships, but this means knowledge, expertise, technology, and finance. This is what I was saying in the very beginning. It's not about the public sector alone. There has to be all sectors which partake in the effort. Next slide, please. So in the end, to go back to what was the topic, what is the topic of this presentation, public goods provisions and securing sustainable development are synonymous. They have equal objectives, equal methodologies, and equal form of partnerships. There has to be governance, there have to be institutions, which brings me to the next slide, where we more or less conclude with saying that what is the topic of this. It's all working only if there is a mobilizing of these partnerships. Next slide, it's more or less repetitive. This is SDG 17. Joint action has to be taken, otherwise there will be people who are left behind, and this has another impact. I am often having fights with CSOs who said, oh, the big corporations just want to improve their reputation and they should be left out. Well, it says leaving no one behind. It has several meanings when you talk about the SDGs, which takes us to the end of this presentation, and we still have time for Q&A. If you go to the next slide, this was the summary already. It also has to take account of COVID, and it has to take account of that there is not enough discussion between scholars and policymakers, between CSOs and businesses, and we hope that this, not alone this presentation, but this very timely topic will improve it. On the next slide, I have just put the sources of the quotations I gave above, and now it's up to Q&A. I hope there will be many. I didn't see any in the chat box, but I would ask people to raise their hand. Otherwise, we will do another discussion between the four authors. Anyone? Just speak out and unmute because I can't see all the...
Yeah, actually, this is Kathy Burko. So I have a question. So you've put a lot of information out there in front of us. It's a lot to digest. So we have a lot of young PhD students that are attending this meeting. So if you were going to put some research ideas out there that you'd like to see them explore based on all of your findings, what would you tell them?
That's a very good question, or a very good suggestion, because there are such a lot of fields of research. I was in a session yesterday where and I will be in one tomorrow, where there are great young people who are very knowledgeable in statistics and econometric methods. There are so many things that can be measured in these topics. I can't do this anymore, even so I have a PhD in econometrics, but that is so long ago. And I would ask people, young people, to connect this type of issues with statistical evidence, which we didn't do in the book. We were thinking it's better to tell stories or give evidence than to do an anonymous analysis. What are the impacts of such and such on such and such? But this is how scientific work should be done, and I would invite people, young people, to do this.
I would probably add to that too. And one of the last slides talked about public-private partnerships. And this is something that's spoken of frequently. And we talk about, and of course we did at length, about the responsibilities of the different members of society. And if we want to have a world in the future, which we all do for our children and so forth, that we all need to be participants. So regarding the young, I mean, you have to be current and up to date, but in your research efforts, you have to look at what your role and responsibility is, regardless, whether you're in the business sector or you're in the social sector or the humanities or whatever it is, because it's a collective effort. So those efforts, and I think COVID has done a marvelous job, especially when we look at those countries that have been successful in responding to COVID. What we found was, of course, leadership and quick responsiveness, but that responsiveness involved all sectors of society. And I think in the same way, as I had said earlier, these are global problems. So it will take global solutions. And we need to see models that can be successful in responding to that. And of course, doing research and measuring it with it.
I would like to add two very concrete topics for young PhD students. And the first one pertains to the negative externalities. As we know, businesses can produce whatever they are producing, and they might cause enormous environmental damage, but they're not accountable really for it, except, of course, if they cause an absolute disaster, which then has to be cleaned up and people lose lives. That's a different story. But overall, we haven't found a way to measure and to make sure that the externalities are incorporated in the price of the goods and services that producers put out to the market. We need that also in the international trade system. We're discussing about how to prevent polluters from other countries who just dump their goods at inexpensive prices, but are basically full of negative externalities. So what to do about it, and maybe they could do a simulation so we could better understand how to measure this and how to make the prices more transparent and in that sense more sustainable. The negative externalities, that's one thing. Not enough is done for the positive externalities. Positive externalities could be, for instance, we talked a lot about agriculture. That is, the apple tree farmer, well, not to spray too many times with pesticides the product that's being then afterwards put into the market. Not only that the consumers might suffer from it, but think about the beekeepers. The bees need to have access to trees and the blossoming trees for what they're doing, which is to collect that to bring back and then to produce the honey. So the production, we should think about the interdependencies in a positive sense. That's the positive externalities, that the farmer with his apple production could be very essentially contributing to the beekeeper and to reduce. I've seen in Europe, apple farmers, 20 times they spray their apple until they put them out to the market, which is incredible, you think about it. So of course it's true, in order to make these round apples that look so perfect, they have to spray, but they don't necessarily have to spray that often. But that's not the main point I want to make. The other point is, what is it that their production could positively support another production, another process, such as the beekeepers? That's understudied. And if they could also do a simulation to show that through better coordination, interdependencies of producers could really generate a lot of positive outcomes, but we don't discuss this that much.
Thank you. Well, I think at this point, unless we have more questions, what it would be nice to do while everybody's here is have everybody turn on their video who's been minimized. I'm talking to you out in the audience, and we'll get a group picture. We have a way of doing that from the screen, kind of like Hollywood Squares. So anyway, so if everyone will turn on your video. So Brian, Carmen, Candida, right? Everybody turns on your video. Yep. We still got a few people out there.
Nigel.
There we go. A few more people. Turn on your videos. Yeah. Hello. Olu, turn on your video. Yeah. There we go. A few more. Carmen, can you turn on your video so we see you?
Carmen,
She may not be, yeah, she may not be hearing us. Yeah. Well, at any rate, those might be the only ones that can hear us right now. So why don't we go ahead and get the photo? Maya, are you in charge?
I am ready on 3. Everyone ready?
All right, everybody smile.
Hold a second.
All
Okay.
right. He wasn't
All
ready to
right.
smile yet. All right.
Okay. All right.
All right. Cheese.
Smiling.
All right. 1, 2, 3. All right.
Got
Hold
us?
your smiles. Let me take another one just to make sure.
Okay.
Okay.
Oh, Brian, look up.
All right.
All right. Thank
Here.
you.
You guys are good to stop
Wonderful.
smiling.
All
Thank
right.
We have a minute. I can add a quick comment.
Sure.
Yeah, we have 1 minute left.
Yeah, I think the most difficult thing about policy making in the context of SDGs is the interlinkages and interdependencies. There's a 2019 report done by the SDSN, which is led by Professor Jeffrey Sachs. They look at how does these different goals interlink with each other. Can they create co-benefits, meaning that if you do something in the health sector or in the food sector, it might benefit health. Or there's also somehow, there's a negative relationship between some of the goals. And I think, in order to help developing countries, if we recognize that we are indeed living in the same ecosystem, we need to do more research or to create simulations, modeling, to allow the policymakers to put their national data into it in order to at least forecast or play out different scenarios. Because without these tools to support, what you will see is that a very small part of the world, very small portion of the world population will continue trying to reach sustainability, while the rest, I'm sorry, we're going to see more, displacement of population, more migration, more refugees, more wars. So this polarization issue cannot be bridged and resolved. And I think business PhDs could contribute to this higher level of thinking and trying to sort of come up with some modeling, allow us to use existing data to do some sense making for the developing countries.
Wonderful. Catherine, I thank you so much for hosting us. And
Thank
I
you
hope
for speaking. We were very glad to have you. It's been a fascinating